He didn't say he was lonely. He didn't say he was lost. He just let the ranch fall apart around him, one cold season at a time, and called it living. Then she appeared, uninvited, unannounced, and completely unimpressed by his grief. And she handed him a list, not of his failures, of what could still be fixed. On this channel, we believe the West was built not just by tough men and wild horses, but by the quiet, fierce, tender love between people who found each other at exactly the right moment of falling apart. What this story leaves with you: sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't pick up a gun, it's set a second plate at a table they'd stopped eating at alone. If this story touched something in you, subscribe, leave your city in the comments, and share it with someone who needs a little warmth today. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
Ethan was not a man who spooked easy. He'd faced down dangers that would make most men turn tail. He'd even stood by his wife's grave in a downpour and didn't let a single tear fall. It wasn't that he didn't feel it. There was just nobody left to see it. 3 years of silence. 3 years of riding out to an empty sunrise and coming home to a dark house. So when he pushed open his own front door and saw a young woman by the stove, he just froze. Her eyes were dark, and they held something that was older and harder than plain old fear. Her name, she said, was Lydia Hart, and before he went for his rifle, he ought to know his supper was almost on the table. Ethan just stared. He tried to speak. "Ma'am, you are in my house." "I know," she said. "Using my stove?" "Yes." She'd cleaned the place. The stack of dirty dishes was gone, washed, and put away proper. The floor was swept clean. She'd even folded the blanket on the chair by the fire, the one he always left in a heap because it just did not matter. "You cleaned my house." "It needed it," she said, and turned right back to her cooking. Ethan stood there, mouth open and rifle half raised, with no earthly idea what to do. He'd come home expecting the usual cold and quiet. He sure as heck had not expected this. "How did you get in here?" he finally asked. "Your back window latch is broken." "I noticed it from outside," she said over her shoulder. "You ought to fix that. Anybody could get in." "Somebody did," Ethan said flatly. A hint of a smile touched her lips. She put the pot on the table and set out a bowl and spoon, just like it was the most normal thing in the world, as if a man with a rifle wasn't standing there with his jaw clenched tight. "Sit down," she said. "Eat. Then I will explain everything." "You will explain it right now," Ethan growled, "before I go get the sheriff." She turned to face him, and that is when he really saw her. Her dress was torn and caked with mud. One of her boots was crudely stitched together with twine, and on her wrist he saw the faint yellow of a fading bruise, maybe 4 or 5 days old. Ethan lowered the rifle. He did not put it down, but he lowered it. "Explain," he said, his voice low and steady. Lydia sat down at the table, folded her hands, and looked him square in the eye. She told him the truth, plain and simple. She'd been with a wagon train coming from Tucson. 3 days ago, a flash flood hit. They lost wagons and they lost a man. She paused. "I did not have any family on that train," she said. "My mule had to be put down." She said it without emotion, which told Ethan she'd already mourned that loss alone. "I walked for 2 days to get to Dry Creek, but the hotel cost 15 cents a night, and I do not have 15 cents. The man at the feed store told me about a rancher who lived alone a few miles out, said the place was run down, and the man who owned it had lost heart. So I thought," she looked down at her hands, "I thought I could offer a trade. A few hot meals and a clean house in exchange for a roof over my head for a few nights." "You just let yourself into a man's home?" Ethan asked. "I checked to see if anyone was here first," she said. "When no one was, I started a fire. I figured you would either come home and accept my offer or you would come home and run me off. Either way, you would get a hot meal." Ethan looked at her, at the bruise and the worn-out boots. He saw she was not beaten down, just settled, ready for whatever came next. He sat down. "3 days," he said. "That is it. And you will sleep in the barn." She nodded. "I am not a kind man," he warned her. "I am not asking for kindness," she replied. "I am asking to trade my work for shelter." Ethan picked up the spoon and took a bite of stew. It was good. It was better than good. It tasted like warmth, like something he had lost a long, long time ago. "Fine," he said. 3 days. The next morning, she was up before him. That was the first surprise. He woke to the sounds of someone moving around in his kitchen, and for the first time in years, some of the tightness in his chest loosened up. When he walked in, coffee was already made. She stood at the window looking out at the ranch. "Your east fence is down for about 60 yards, she said without turning. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "You walked the fence line already?" "Could not sleep," she said simply. "And something has been getting into the chicken coop. There is a hole in the back wall. Also, the water trough by the barn has a crack about 4 inches long. It will break for good when the first freeze hits." Ethan put his cup down slowly. "How long have you been up?" he asked. "About 2 hours." She pulled up a chair and got right to it. On a scrap of brown paper, she had a list of all the work my ranch was crying for. Fixing the fence, patching the coop, mending the trough, and replacing shingles on the barn. Ethan just stared. "Well, you've listed everything wrong with my place," he said. "No," she replied, her voice steady and calm. "I listed what needs doing. There's a big difference." He looked up at her, and she met his gaze. "Mr. Cole, I don't know what troubles happened here, and it is not my business to ask. But I have worked on ranches since I was 9 years old. This is good land that has just been let go." She paused for a moment. 3 days is not enough time to fix it all, but it is enough to make a start. Ethan sat down, thinking. He could have told her it was none of her business. He could have told her 3 days was all she had. But instead he just said, "I will show you where I keep the fencing tools." She took to the work like she was born for it. That is what Ethan could not figure out. She moved with a quiet purpose, like she knew exactly what each job needed before she even started. She never asked for help or complained. She just worked for her own reasons, as if the ranch itself was her boss, not him. That first afternoon, he found himself just watching her. She was driving nails into fence posts with clean, sure swings of the hammer. Not like someone new to it, but like someone who had done it 1,000 times. He walked over. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. She did not even look up. "My father's ranch, outside of Flagstaff," she said between hits. "We had a couple 100 acres, ran cattle." "Had?" he asked. She hammered the last nail in, stood up and pushed her hair back. "Had," she said, and moved on to the next post. Ethan just stood there for a minute. "You want to talk about it?" "No," she said, plain and simple, and kept right on walking. He followed her, not sure why. It was more than feeling sorry for her. It was like he recognized her silence from his own heart. "My wife died," he said suddenly, 3 years back. Lydia stopped but did not turn around. "I am sorry," she said. "A fever took her fast. I was 4 days out on a cattle drive. By the time I got back," he trailed off. The words never got any easier. "There was not much left to come home to. I kept the ranch, but my heart was not in it." She finally turned and looked at him. "That makes sense," she said softly. He had expected pity or the empty words people say. But she just said it made sense, and somehow that was a comfort. That night, he came in from the barn to the smell of fried eggs, salt pork, and fresh biscuits. She had cooked again without a word. She was already at the table, eating. "You do not have to do this," he said. "I know," she answered. "I like to cook. And you look like a man who has not had a proper meal in a long while." He did not argue. He just ate. The quiet between them felt different, like the air before a big storm. "Tell me about this land," she said after a bit. "What was it like before?" "Why?" he asked. "The way a man talks about his land before things went wrong tells you what it could be again." Something warm and uncomfortable stirred in Ethan's chest. "There used to be a creek that ran all year," he said slowly. "Clara planted 4 apple trees by it. I do not know if they are still alive." He looked out the dark window. The south pasture had good grass before the dry years hit. "I had 12 head of cattle when I started," he continued. "Down to 4 now. Lost some, sold some, just never cared enough to build the herd back up." "But you care now," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "Because you are talking about it like it is still real," she answered. He felt seen, with nowhere left to hide. He cleared his throat and stood up. "I'm going to fix the latch on the corral gate," he said, and walked out into the night. But the next morning, everything changed. Hoofbeats pounded up the drive, fast and urgent. It was Tom Briggs from the spread a couple miles south. His face was pale with worry. "Ethan," he said, his voice tight with bad news. "Did you hear what happened in town last night?" "I have not been to town," Ethan said. "Jed Holloway's place," Tom said, leaning down from his horse. "The county marshal served him papers. Says he owes on some old bank claim he never even knew about. They gave him 30 days to pay or get out." A cold dread washed over Ethan. "That cannot be right. Jed's family has had that land since 1879. "I know," Tom said, "but the papers look legal. And there is a man in town, name of Victor Hale. He has got hired men with him, and he has been asking about who owns what." Tom paused. "He is a land grabber, Ethan. The kind that uses the law to take what is not his. And Jed's place is just the start." "What is Jed going to do?" Ethan asked. "What can he do? He cannot afford to fight it." Tom shook his head. "I'm riding out to warn folks. Your land is valuable, sitting between the 2 water sources like it is." After Tom rode off, Ethan just stood there in the yard. He heard Lydia come up behind him. "You heard all that?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Victor Hale," he said, tasting the name. He felt her go completely still. He turned around. The careful distance she always kept was gone. Her face was hard, like an old scar brought back to the light. "You know that name," Ethan stated. It was not a question. Her jaw was set, and her eyes looked right through him at a memory far away. "Yes," she said, her voice flat and cold as a stone. "I do." She had a quiet about her, the kind you see in folks who've been through the fire and learned to live with the heat. "I know that name," Ethan finally said. The silence in the room was heavy. "Tell me." Lydia Hart looked right at him. For the first time, she looked like something that had survived too much, cracked clean through to its hard, dark middle. "My daddy's ranch," she said, her voice flat as a panhandle road. "The one near Flagstaff. Victor Hale took it." She laid the whole story out on the table, not in bits and pieces, but straight through, like reading an official report. Her family had held that land for 11 years. Her father, Daniel Hart, had built it from scratch, turning stubborn, dry dirt into something fine, something that could last. They had cattle and a big garden. Her mama passed when Lydia was 16 and her brother went east and just kept going. It was just her and her daddy, and that was home. Then Victor Hale rode into the territory 2 years back. He had money from the railroad and land companies and a pocket full of lawyers. He bought land from folks who were willing to sell, and for those who weren't, he had other methods. For Daniel Hart, it was a crooked debt claim. Hale's lawyers twisted a water agreement from 15 years ago, changing a single word on a perfect forgery. What was a right-to-use agreement suddenly became a lien against the whole ranch. The forgery was good, and the county judge, who'd just gotten a big donation for his re-election, sided with Hale without much thought. "We had 2 weeks," Lydia said. "The courts wouldn't hear our appeal. The land office said they'd look into it in 6 months, but told us to get off our own property in the meantime. She stared at her hands. My daddy refused to leave. They sent men to persuade him. He's not a fighting man, so he just stood there. But when you build a place with your own 2 hands for 11 years, and a man takes it with a piece of paper, something inside you just gives. He had a stroke, she said, looking up. 3 months ago. He's alive, staying with a kind family in Flagstaff. But he can't work. Can't hardly talk. That's why she was on that wagon train, trying to get to a cousin in New Mexico with nothing left for her in Arizona. Ethan sat there, the lamplight flickering between them. And now Victor Hale is here, he said, doing the same thing all over again. Ethan thought about Jed Holloway and those legal-looking papers. He thought about his own land, the creeks and the pasture. He'll come for my place, Ethan stated. Your land has water on 2 sides, she said softly. In a dry year, that's worth more than gold. Yes, he'll come for it. Ethan got up and walked to the window, his back to her, staring out into the dark. What about the 3 days you asked for? She met his gaze. That was yesterday's offer. He turned back to her. I'm changing the terms. You stay here as long as you need to. In return, you tell me everything you know about Victor Hale. How he operates, his paperwork, his weaknesses, everything. Lydia Hart just looked at him for a long moment. He saw something change in her eyes. It wasn't relief, not really. It was more like the stillness of a person who's been braced for a fall for so long they forgot what solid ground feels like. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. Out there in the dark, the next fight was already heading their way. Ethan Cole didn't know what he was going to do yet, but for the first time in 3 long years, he felt the urge to stand his ground. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat by the cold fireplace long after the lamp went out, turning Victor Hale's name over in his mind. He needed to know just how deep this trouble went. When the first gray light of dawn broke, he knew one thing for sure. He had to ride into town and see this man for himself. A man's reputation is one thing, but the man himself is another. He found Lydia already up in the kitchen, standing by the window with a cup of coffee, same as the day before. I'm heading to town, he told her. She turned, her eyes clear, telling him she hadn't slept much either. You're staying here. She started to speak, but he cut her off. This is not about protecting you. It's about strategy. If one of Hale's men recognizes you, we lose our advantage before we even have one. He held her gaze. You told me he gathers information before he makes a move. Well, so do I. She closed her mouth and gave a single nod. What are you looking for? She asked. I want to see the papers he served Jed Holloway, Ethan said, and I want to look this man in the eye. She was quiet for a second. He'll be polite, she warned. He is not what you expect. He will be well-dressed and well-spoken. He will shake your hand and look you square in the face, and you will walk away thinking he is a reasonable man. She paused. That's his trick. He makes you feel like the bad thing that's coming is perfectly reasonable. Ethan drank his coffee standing up. I have dealt with reasonable men before. Not like this one, she said quietly. When he came to our ranch, he sat at our table. My daddy offered him coffee, and he took it. He sat there and told my father, Mr. Hart, I respect what you've built here. That's why I am giving you this chance to settle things before they get unpleasant. Her jaw clenched. My daddy shook his hand. A man who makes you shake his hand while he is robbing you is the most dangerous kind of man there is. The kitchen was dead silent. Watch his hands, she added. He touches things while he talks. It's a distraction. He wants you watching his hands instead of listening to his words. When a man takes everything from you, you learn who he truly is, one way or another. Ethan took his hat from the door hook. He turned back to her. That water rights agreement you mentioned, you said it was a forgery. Do you have any proof? A shadow of old pain passed over her face. My father had the original, she said. It was in a lockbox hidden under the floorboards. After they forced us out, I went back to get it. The box was gone. He took it before we could even appeal, she explained. That man leaves nothing to chance. Ethan put his hat on and walked out. The quiet in Dry Creek felt wrong that morning. People stood talking in tight little groups, their voices hushed. Mabel Greer watched him from her store window, but did not offer her usual wave. The whole town was tense, like a herd of cattle that smells a storm coming on the wind. He found Jed Holloway first at the hardware store. Jed was not working. He just sat staring at a document on the table, his face like stone. He looked up when Ethan came in, a flicker of relief in his eyes. Ethan? Jed. Ethan pulled up a chair. Let me see it. Jed slid the paper across the table. Ethan read it. The claim was based on a promissory note from 1881, which was supposedly signed by Jed's father. Ethan looked up. Jed, did your father sign any notes in 1881? Jed's jaw set hard. My father passed on in 1879. There it was, a clear and simple forgery. Ethan met his gaze. This is a matter for the court, Jed. You are going to need a lawyer. I do not have money for a lawyer, Ethan. Who else received papers? Ethan asked. Minnie Calhoun got one this morning, Jed replied, and they are planning to visit Pete Reyes this afternoon. It is not random, Ethan. He is going after everyone with good water access first. Ethan recalled what Lydia had said about his own property, how it sat right between two springs. Has anyone spoken to this man directly? He asked. He calls this an opportunity. The words settled in the air like dust. Ethan stood up. Do not sign a single thing, Jed. Do you understand me? Jed looked up at him. You know something about this man? I know enough, Ethan said. I will be in touch with you. Ethan found Victor Hale in the hotel saloon. Hale sat at a corner table with two men who watched the room. Just as Lydia had described, he looked like a calm, well-dressed gentleman, the kind of man who gets what he wants with quiet patience. Hale smiled as Ethan walked up. Good morning. You have the look of a man with something on his mind. My name is Ethan Cole. I own the land 4 miles east of here. Mr. Cole, Hale said, his voice as smooth as Riverstone. I have studied your property. It is a fine piece of land with 2 natural water sources. My land is not for sale, Ethan said plainly. He looked straight into Hale's eyes and saw a deep and unnerving patience there. I will be watching you, Ethan said. Hale gave a slight nod. I would hope so. He paused and his voice turned soft as a whisper. I also hope you are not being influenced by outside parties, Mr. Cole. A man who is alone on his land with no family ought to be very careful where he gets his advice. Ethan rode home hard, his mind racing. Hale had made 2 things very clear. He was coming for Ethan's land, and he knew Lydia was there. He found her by the west fence and rode right up to her. She saw the look on his face and her hands went still. He knows you're here, Ethan said. She did not look surprised, only weary. What did he say? He did not use your name, but he warned me about taking advice from outsiders with their own interests. Lydia nodded. That is how he works. He comes to a place and buys information. He knows everything about everyone before he ever makes a move. Who in Dry Creek would tell him about you? Ethan asked. She thought for a second. The man at the feed store. He handed her back the fence tool she had set down. Show me what you were doing with this, he said. They worked together for the rest of the afternoon. The silence between them felt different now. More like 2 people who understood they were on the same side of a fight. Later, Lydia broke the quiet. The document he used against my father, she said. There was another mistake in it, not just the forged signature. Ethan looked at her. The notary seal, she explained. Our water rights were filed in Yavapai County back in 1871. Any change to a Yavapai document must be notarized with a Yavapai seal, but the seal on his forgery was from Maricopa County. I did not realize it until it was much too late. Ethan stood quietly for a moment. It will not be the same mistake on Jed's paper, she said. He is careful and he learns. But there will be a flaw. There always is. You just have to know what you're looking for. The trouble is, she continued, that finding the flaw and finding an expert who can testify about it in court are two different things. Is there a person like that? Ethan asked. Yes, she said. A former federal land examiner. His name is Aldridge, and he lives in Prescott. But getting him here, building a case before Hale moves forward, that takes time. We might only have weeks. Then we have days, not weeks, Ethan declared. She stared at him, surprised by his conviction. You are serious. You told me my land was worth fighting for, he said. You said Jed Holloway was worth fighting for. I did not look that man in the face just to come home and do nothing. You hardly know Jed Holloway, she said softly. No, Ethan said. But I know what it feels like to have land, and then to lose the one thing that made it all matter. I will not stand by and watch that man do to these people what someone should have stopped from happening before. A friend who might expose the forgery. Aldridge, she said, in Prescott. If any man can prove the forgery in court, it is him. Can we reach him by telegraph? Maybe, if the town office will send it. Write it all down tonight, Ethan said. Everything you remember about the papers, the seals, all of it. I will take it to the telegraph office at first light. She was quiet for a spell. Ethan, she said, his name sounding careful on her tongue. Why are you doing all this? You do not know me. He did not answer right away. He gathered the tools and started for the barn, and she walked beside him. After a few steps in silence, he spoke without looking at her. You told me last night my ranch is still real because I speak of it in the present tense. Yes, you're still talking about your daddy's place that way, he said. You said, it is good land, not it was. He pushed the big barn door open. Have you ever been backed into a corner so tight you had nowhere left to go? That was Lydia Hart, facing a powerful man named Victor Hale, who was dead set on stealing her family's land. And Ethan Cole, well, he hadn't cared about much of anything for 3 long years, but her fight was about to change all that. This is the story of what happens when folks who've been beaten down decide it is time to fight back. Lydia stood there in the barn door, watching him. Ethan moved through the soft light of the lantern, doing his evening chores, a man who finally remembered what it was to have a purpose. An hour later, he found her at the kitchen table. She had 3 pages written out, laying out everything she knew about the crooked paperwork with a clearness that impressed him. She looked up, plumb tuckered out, but with a fire in her eyes. Is this enough? He asked her. She glanced at the papers. It's all I've got. Then it's enough, he told her. He went to bed that night listening to the wind, thinking about the whole sorry mess and about Lydia, writing by lamplight at his table. And right then a cold, simple truth hit him. Victor Hale was used to people staying beat. He was about to learn a hard lesson. At first light, Ethan sent the telegram. The telegraph operator, a young fella named Curtis, read the message, and his eyebrows shot up. That's a whole lot of legal talk for a rancher, Curtis said, kind of suspicious. Just send it, Ethan said. Every last word. It's going to a federal land examiner in Prescott. He put the money down, and Curtis sent it. Ethan rode home feeling mighty exposed. One of Hale's men had been sitting on the saloon porch watching his every move. A big fella in a gray coat had stared him down as he went in and out of the telegraph office. It was a look meant to be a warning. Ethan had stared right back until the man looked away. It was a small win, but he'd take it. When he got back, Lydia was already tearing into the overgrown garden plot. For 3 years, he'd let it go to ruin, but she was out there with a fork, pulling up tangled roots with her bare hands. Did you send it? She asked when he rode up. Every word, he said. Now, we just wait. She nodded and got back to her work. He realized that was how she handled being scared. She did not sit still with it, she moved against it. He went and got another fork to help. They worked all morning, hardly saying a word. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from working together toward the same thing. This was her garden, Lydia said, stating a fact. Ethan stuck the fork in the dirt. She had tomatoes here and beans and squash. He paused for a moment. I reckon I couldn't bear to look at it after she was gone. I can understand that, Lydia said softly. But I let it go too long, he said. He looked over the patch of cleared earth. Might be too late in the season to get much growing. Not for winter squash, she told him. If we plant it now in good soil, we could have a harvest by November. She knelt and picked up a handful of dirt, rubbing it between her fingers. This soil ain't as dead as it looks. There is still life in it. She looked up at him. Good land always holds on longer than you think. He knew she was not just talking about the garden. The answer from Prescott came the very next morning, delivered by Curtis himself. The Federal Examiner, a man named Aldridge, said he would come. But he needed proof. He needed the original papers Hale had served on her family, or a certified copy from the county. Aldridge said he'd come to Dry Creek if they could prove the forgery matched what he'd seen a couple of years back in Maricopa County. Someone else had tried to fight Hale back then. The original papers are gone, Lydia said slowly. Then she stopped cold. But there's a filing copy. We had to submit the document to the territorial court for our appeal. The court would have made a copy for their records. Ethan understood immediately. A certified court record is still a legal document, he said. And if it has the same fake seal, she said, taking a deep breath, that's enough. That's enough for Aldridge. So how do we get it? The records office is in Prescott, she said. I would have to go myself. Which means leaving the ranch, she worried. I'll go with you, Ethan said right away. She gave him a look, surprised. That's a 2-day ride each way. I know how far it is, he said. Tom Briggs owes me a favor. He'll watch the place. He looked her straight in the eye. Lydia. Victor Hale is not going to wait. Every day we waste is a day he's using against us. We have to make the first move. She read the telegram one last time. When do we leave? She asked. Tomorrow, at dawn, he replied. He found a pair of his late wife Clara's old boots, ones he had not been able to look at for 3 years, and left them on the table for Lydia. Try these on, he said, and walked out before she could answer. The next morning she was wearing them. They rode for 2 hours before Ethan spotted the rider. He had been keeping an eye on their back trail just in case. Half a mile behind them, a man on a big horse was keeping pace, never getting closer, never falling behind. Don't turn around, he told Lydia in a low voice. How long has he been there? She asked, her hands tightening on the reins. Since we left town, he said. Gray coat, big horse. That is the same fella who was watching me from the saloon porch. One of Hale's men, she said. It was not a question. He knows we're going somewhere, Ethan said. But he does not know where. He sent that man to find out. So what do we do? Ethan thought on it. He knew this road well. In about 6 miles it split. The main road was wide open, but a smaller trail cut south through a canyon. It was rougher and longer, but inside that canyon they could disappear, less than a 1/4 mile back. Ethan pointed. There is a fork in the road up ahead. When I give the word, we are going to ride hard. How hard? He asked. Fast enough that he will not know which trail we took. She shot him a look. I can ride a horse. I know you can. No, I mean I can really ride, she insisted. Do not you dare slow down on my account. A little smile tugged at his mouth. Then you better keep up. He kept their pace even, letting the fork draw closer. A mile out, then half a mile. In his mind, he measured the distance to their follower. Still the same, still watching. 200 yards from the turn, Ethan said, Now. And they were gone. He did not look back, hearing her horse thunder right beside his. The ground changed as they hit the canyon path, and the rock walls rose up to swallow the sky. The only sound was their horses running flat out through the narrow pass. He did not ease up for a whole mile. When he finally stopped, They were so deep in the canyon you could not even see the main road. Lydia pulled up next to him, breathing hard with her hair coming loose. She looked behind them. Nothing. She let out a sharp breath. He will have no idea where we went. Not for a little while, Ethan said, but it will be long enough. She faced forward, pushing her hair back. You knew about that trail. I used to ride it with Clara before the new road was built, he told her. It is going to add a couple of hours to our trip. Worth it, she said. He agreed. They rode until nightfall and stopped at a small homestead. Ethan knew the family there, the Fisks, who always took in travelers if they would lend a hand with the chores. The next morning, Lydia had already fixed a broken porch step before anyone even had breakfast. Mrs. Fisk watched her with that quiet approval ranch women have for each other when they see someone who understands hard work. At dinner, Mrs. Fisk looked between the two of them with the frankness of a woman who has earned her opinions. Are you two married? She asked. Lydia's hand stopped moving. No, ma'am, Ethan said. Mrs. Fisk just looked at him. You have been alone since Clara passed on. Yes, ma'am. That is a long time to be alone, she said, and passed the bread. That was the end of it. But for a moment, Ethan could feel Lydia's eyes on him. He just kept looking at his plate. They got to Prescott on the afternoon of the second day. A thin clerk named Marsh, who looked like he had lost interest in his job 30 years ago, worked at the court records office. Lydia clearly stated what she needed, a certified copy of a document from the Heartland Appeal in Yavapai County from 1883. Marsh went into the back without a word. They waited for 20 minutes. Ethan watched the door. Lydia sat perfectly straight with her hands folded, her face showing nothing. He knew she must have learned that stillness in some hard place. She had learned how to wait while powerful people made decisions about her life. He hated that for her. Marsh came back and set a document on the counter. Lydia leaned forward to read it, and Ethan saw her eyes go sharp. The seal, she said, her voice tight and low. Maricopa, Ethan said, reading next to her. A Yavapai County filing with a Maricopa notary seal. She looked at Marsh. Is Mr. Aldridge's office located on Gurley Street? Marsh blinked. Yes, ma'am. It is the third door past the assay office. She was already moving, and Ethan was right behind her. Franklin Aldridge was a man of about 60, with a weathered face that told you he had spent most of his life outdoors. He listened to Lydia's whole story without interrupting. He stared at the court document for a long time. Then he put it down and said, I have seen this seal before. The room went silent. Not on this particular document, Aldridge said, but this specific notary stamp. Look at the number right below it, 1147. He opened a drawer, pulled out a file, and laid a paper in front of them. This is from a case in Maricopa County from 1881. Different land, different county, another forged debt claim, but the exact same stamp number. He tapped it. A notary seal number is unique to one person. This stamp, 1147, was issued to a notary in Phoenix. He retired in 1879, and his seal was reported stolen after he died. Aldridge looked straight at them. For at least 4 years, Victor Hale has been using a dead man's stolen seal on fake documents. The silence in the room was absolute. Lydia let out a single, long, controlled exhale. Can you testify to that in court? Ethan asked. I have been waiting 2 years for someone to bring me enough to do just that, Aldridge said flatly. I had the Maricopa case, but Hale offered the family just enough money to drop it. He closed the folder. If you can get me in front of a judge in Dry Creek with this, I can build a case to disqualify every single forged document that seal appears on. Every single one. Ethan looked at Lydia. She was staring at the document, and her face held something he had not seen before. It was not relief, not yet, but it was the start of it, like the first crack of light under a door that had been shut for years. My father's land, she whispered. If the document that took it has the same seal, then the legal claim against his property was fraudulent, Aldridge said. That means the ruling can be challenged. His voice was careful, not promising anything that was not real. It will not be simple. It will not be fast. But it is possible. But it is... Lydia sat with that for a moment. Ethan watched her, knowing there was nothing for him to say. She straightened her back and lifted her chin. "When can you come to Dry Creek?" "Give me 2 days to get my documentation together," Aldridge said. "We need you there before Hale has time to push the current claims through," Ethan urged. "He has already served the papers." "Then I will be there in 1 day," Aldridge stated simply. "I will leave tomorrow morning." He stood and shook Ethan's hand. Then he looked at Lydia, at the hard-won strength in her eyes, and he held out his hand to her, too. "Your father built something worth protecting," he said. "I am sorry it took this long for someone to help you do it." Lydia shook his hand, not trusting her voice enough to speak. They were on the road again within the hour. Ethan pushed the pace, knowing they had to get back to Dry Creek before Hale could make another move. They rode mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with purpose. About an hour outside of Prescott, Lydia finally spoke. "When we were in Aldridge's office, she began, when he said we could challenge it all. I want you to know I came to your ranch because I needed a safe place for 3 nights. That was the truth." She paused. "But I stayed because I thought I could help. When Tom Briggs said Victor Hale's name, that was not an accident for me." Ethan rode beside her. "You think you came to my ranch for a reason," he said. "I think I ended up in the right place," she answered carefully. "I do not think a person always knows the reasons ahead of time. Sometimes you just have to keep going until you find some solid ground." He thought about his empty house and the smell of warm bread that had hit him like a fistful of memories. He thought about the list she had made of everything wrong with his ranch and handed it to him like a gift. "Lydia," he said, keeping his eyes on the trail. "Yes, I'm mighty glad you did not leave after 3 days." A heavy silence hung between them. Then she finally told him the rest of the story. The reason she was alone, with nothing to her name, was a powerful man named Victor Hale. He had driven her off her land back in Arizona, and she had been running ever since. She was not just looking for shelter. She was looking for a safe place to figure out how to fight back. Just as the weight of her words settled in, they heard a horse coming up fast. It was their neighbor, Tom Briggs, and the look on his face was one of pure trouble. He slid off his horse before it even stopped. "Ethan," he said, his voice tight with worry, "Hale's men are in town. 2 of them posted up outside the hotel. They have been asking questions." Ethan looked from Tom's worried face to Lydia's steady gaze. It seemed her past had finally caught up to her, right here on his doorstep. And Victor Hale was about to find out he had pushed the wrong woman too far. "While you were out. He's called for an emergency court hearing day after tomorrow. The county judge is driving all the way from Tucson." Tom paused, looking grave. "And that is not the worst of it." Ethan stood silent. "He served papers to 3 more ranchers yesterday," Tom said. "Pete Reyes, Minnie Calhoun, and Frank Dodd over on the East Ridge." He glanced at Lydia, who had swung down from her horse and was now standing right by Ethan. "Then this morning, one of his men rode out here. Told me to tell you Mr. Hale expects you for a meeting tonight." The way Tom said it, it was no friendly invitation. Ethan felt a muscle jump in his jaw. "What time?" 7 o'clock, at the hotel." Ethan looked at Lydia. He could see her mind racing, figuring all the angles just like she always did when things got sideways. "He knows we went to Prescott," she said, her voice low. "His man followed us to the fork. Hale is just moving up the court date to cut us off at the pass." Ethan nodded. "Jed, Pete Reyes, Minnie Calhoun, Frank Dodd. We have to show them what we found, and they need to stand with us in that courtroom. And I have to go meet Victor Hale at 7. Ethan finished. She stopped and turned to him. "You are actually going to go?" "Yes," he said simply. "Why?" "Because the best way to deal with a man who likes to keep folks off balance," Ethan explained, is to walk right in there looking like you have not got a single worry in the world. He went by himself. He left Lydia at the ranch making a list. He was starting to see that was her way of handling things. Some folks pray, some folks drink, but Lydia Hart made lists. He rode into Dry Creek just as the last bit of daylight faded. Hale was at the same table in the corner, looking just as patient as before. But something was different tonight. A faint tightness around his eyes, a focus that was sharper than before. He had been stewing for 4 days, wondering what Ethan was up to in Prescott, and that kind of not knowing did not sit well with a man used to holding all the cards. "Good evening, Mr. Cole," he pointed to the chair. "Thank you for coming. Your invitation was a hard one to turn down," Ethan said as he sat. Hale watched him for a beat, then folded his hands on the table, deciding to get straight to business. "You went to Prescott. People do travel," Ethan said. "You went to the Territorial Court Records Office," Hale stated, "and you saw Franklin Aldridge." He watched Ethan's face for a reaction. "Yes, I have people. In Prescott, too, I have people most everywhere." He let that sink in. "I know what Aldridge does, and I want you to understand. Whatever tall tale he spun for you, his proof is not as strong as he thinks." Ethan did not say a word. "He had a theory 2 years back," Hale went on. "It did not hold water then, and it will not hold water now. I want to offer you a better way out of this." He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, and laid it on the table between them. "I'm ready to buy your ranch for 140% of its assessed value. Cash, within the week." He paused. "That is a generous offer." Ethan glanced at the paper, then back at Hale. "Why my land, specifically?" he asked. Hale smiled. "You already know why. You have 2 water sources on your property. When the railroad comes through here, and it will, the rights to that water will be worth 10 times what I am offering you." He leaned in a little. "I am not trying to cheat you, Mr. Cole. I am trying to give you an escape from a life you seem to have already checked out of." The air between them was thick with silence. Ethan thought about what Lydia had told him. "He makes you feel like whatever is coming is the only reasonable choice." He pictured Daniel Hart at his own table, having coffee with this man before signing away 11 years of his life on a handshake. "You made the same kind of offer to the Hart family," Ethan said, his voice even. "Back in Flagstaff." A flicker of something crossed Hale's face. It was tiny and gone in an instant. "I have done business in many territories." "Daniel Hart," Ethan pressed. "Flagstaff, 1883. A water rights deal with a Maricopa notary seal, filed in Yavapai County." He watched Hale's face, just like Lydia had taught him. The face tells the story, not the hands. "Are you going to tell me that seal number 1147 showing up on your Dry Creek papers is just a coincidence?" The whole feel of the room changed. Hale's calm expression did not break, but it became rigid. It was like a brick wall when the ground beneath it shifts. It holds itself together with pure, focused effort. "I think," Hale said, his voice barely a whisper, "that you should be very careful about making claims you cannot back up." "I did not make a claim," Ethan said pleasantly. "I just asked a question." He stood and reached for his hat. "Day after tomorrow in that courtroom, Franklin Aldridge is going to answer it for everybody." He settled his hat on his head. "Good evening, Mr. Hale." He turned and walked out. His hands were perfectly steady, but his heart was pounding against his ribs. He did not let any of it show as he crossed the street to his horse. He rode home hard and fast. There was a lot of night left, and they had a lot to get done before the sun came up. By 9 o'clock, they were all gathered in Ethan's kitchen. Jed Holloway had the paper Hale served him laid out on the table like it was evidence in a trial. Pete Reyes, a quiet man around 40, watched everything and said little. Minnie Calhoun, who was 62 and had run her ranch alone for 8 years, sat with her arms crossed, looking like she was waiting for a darn good explanation. Frank Dodd, who owned the biggest spread of them all, just looked tired of being dragged into another mess. Tom Briggs leaned against the wall, a coffee cup in his hand. Lydia stood at the head of the table, and Ethan saw how the room quieted down when she began to speak. She did not ask for their trust. She just put the certified court copy on the table, laid Aldridge's comparison document right next to it, and walked them through the evidence. Her voice was clear and steady, like someone who had gone over this in her mind 100 times, knowing this day would come. The document used against my family had notary seal number 1147, she said. This is the seal of a dead man. It was stolen. Franklin Aldridge has the records of its use in Maricopa County. He is riding in tomorrow with the proof. She looked from one rancher to the next. I need to know which of you will let him examine your documents. Minnie Calhoun was the first to speak. All of them, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Every single page that man sent to my ranch. Some Pete Reyes just nodded. Same here. Frank Dodd leaned over the table, squinting at the seal number on the copy. He was a man who read the fine print, which was a good quality most times, but it made him slow to move when things got urgent. What if that seal is not on my papers, he asked. What if he used something different on me? Lydia explained that Aldridge could prove the fraud on 3 other properties, which made every document, including Jed's, look mighty suspicious. She looked him square in the eye. But I reckon you will find the seal. Hale found a system that worked for him, and men like that do not fix what is not broken. Jed just sat there quietly, staring at the papers. He looked like a man sitting by a fresh grave. He finally looked up. My father's name is on that paper, he said, his voice all rough. Even if we win, that forgery is in a legal record somewhere. My father's name attached to a lie. I want it on record that it is a forgery, not just that the claim is thrown out. The kitchen got real quiet. That is what Aldridge's testimony will do, Lydia said, her voice softer now. He will call the seal a fraud and show the pattern. Your father's name gets cleared. That is the whole point of this. Jed nodded. Good, he said quietly. That is good. Minnie Calhoun reached over and gave his hand one firm pat. That was her way of giving a long hug. Aldridge stated that this changes things. It goes from a land dispute to possible criminal fraud against a whole bunch of landowners. He paused for a moment. I want the county marshal in that courtroom tomorrow. The county marshal? Ethan asked, choosing his words with care. He recently got a big donation from somebody who did not leave a name, Aldridge told them. You think Hale owns him? I think we just do not know, Lydia said. That means we cannot trust him, but we cannot leave him out either. We have to act like the hearing is honest and build a case so strong that any crooked business is harder to hide than to deal with. Aldridge looked at her for a second. You have given this a lot of thought. For 3 months, yes, she answered. He glanced at Ethan. Is she always like this? Pretty much, Ethan said. Late that afternoon, Hale made his play. Ethan was in the barn when Tom Briggs came riding in hard for the second time in a week. By then, the sight of Tom Briggs riding fast with a worried look meant things had just gotten worse. Hale's men went to Jed's place, Tom said without hardly stopping. 3 of them about an hour ago. Tom learned the court date was now 6 in the morning. Hale's offer on the land would be gone by midnight. After that, he planned to use the full force of the law. Jed had just hours to decide. Take the money or face a judge at dawn with nothing guaranteed. Is Jed going to hold? Tom asked. He will hold, Ethan answered, already moving. He looked at Tom. Are you with us until the end? Tom had watched this county get carved up for 2 years. He felt the weight of that question. All the way, he finally said. Ethan nodded. Then ride. He knew he would find Lydia in the garden. Of course he did. When the pressure was on, she put her hands in the dirt like other people pray. She looked up as he walked over. He moved the hearing, she said, stating a fact. 6 in the morning, he confirmed. She stood up straight. He wants the judge to rule on the land claims before Aldridge can show the evidence of fraud. It was a dirty trick, and it might just work. She was already thinking ahead. Aldridge has to file a motion tonight. It has to demand that the fraud evidence gets heard first. We need a paper record of that request before court starts. Ethan told her the lawyer was at the hotel. Then we go to the hotel, she said simply. Hale's men are there. Then we go carefully. He almost smiled at her nerve. You are not afraid of much, are you? Her tough exterior softened for just a moment, and he saw the truth. It was not a lack of fear, but a constant choice to act in spite of it. I am afraid of plenty, she said quietly. I worry my father will not get better. I worry this fight will drag on for years. She paused, then looked right at him. And I am most afraid that I have pulled you into a battle that could cost you everything you have left. But Ethan shook his head. You did not drag me into anything. I walked in with my own 2 feet the day I looked Victor Hale in the eye. That was my choice. He told her that her hard work, from the fence line to the notes she wrote late at night, was a help, never a burden. Do you understand me? He asked. She just looked at him for a long second. It was a new look, not guarded or professional, but open. It hit him harder than he expected. I understand you, she said. Good. Now let's go find our lawyer. They used a back way to the hotel that Ethan knew from his old delivery days. Aldridge answered the door like a man who knew trouble was coming to call. He had his jacket on before Ethan even finished explaining. I will write the motion now. I need the name of the county court clerk. Lydia spoke right up. Harold Birch. He should be home by 8. If you get the papers to him by 9, he has to log them for tomorrow. Aldridge just stared at her. How do you know the clerk's schedule? I asked the cook when we came in, she said. They waited in the hall while Aldridge worked. Lydia sat on a bench with her eyes closed, not sleeping, just thinking. After a bit, she spoke without opening her eyes. When this is all over, I need to go see my father in Flagstaff. She explained that her father needed to know that someone stood up and fought back for him. He needed to know that they did not just let it go. We will get his land back, Ethan said with confidence. She opened her eyes. You cannot promise that. No, he admitted, but Aldridge can make it possible. And possible is a whole lot more than we had 4 days ago. She thought on that for a second, then closed her eyes again. Yes, she whispered. It is. Aldridge came out looking like a man spoiling for a fight he had waited on for years. They left for Harold Birch's house. Mr. Birch answered his door in a house robe. He read the motion through 2 times, then stamped it into the court record without a single question. The timestamp read, 8:57. It was officially done. Now, no matter what Hale planned for the morning, that motion was on the record demanding the fraud evidence be heard first. As they walked back through the dark streets, Lydia suddenly stopped him. Listen. Up ahead by the hotel, they heard 2 men talking in low, urgent voices. One was Hale's man, the one who was always watching. Ethan pulled Lydia into the shadows. They caught just enough. Aldridge filed something. Hale needs to know tonight. Then one man hurried back inside, leaving the watcher standing there. He looked like a man who had just seen his perfect plan start to crack. They know about the motion, Lydia breathed. Yes, Ethan said. What does a man like Hale do when his plans fall apart? He thought about that man's cold, patient eyes. I honestly do not know. Me neither, she said, standing close beside him in the narrow shadow. But I reckon we're about to find out. The whole town felt still and quiet around them. Tomorrow at 6 in the morning, everything they worked for would either hold up or fall to pieces. The ranchers would either stand together or break. The judge would either be fair or bought. The evidence would either be enough or it would not. Ethan knew this feeling well, this standing on the edge of a cliff. He had felt it the night he learned his wife was gone. There is only one thing to do. You either move toward the thing you fear, or you do not. He looked over at Lydia in the dark. She was already staring at the courthouse. "Get some sleep," he told her. "You first," she replied. Both of them knew it was not going to happen. 6 o'clock arrived, cold and gray. Ethan had not slept, and he figured Lydia had not either. She came out of the barn looking composed with her hair pinned up and Clara's boots on her feet. She looked like a woman who decided she would meet the day head on, no matter what it brought. They did not talk much on the ride to town. All the words had been said the night before. What was left was a quiet, solid understanding between them. Their friends were already there. Jed Holloway stood with his wife, who held his arm with her jaw set firm. There was Pete Reyes and Minnie Calhoun in her Sunday dress, which for her was more of a war declaration than a sign of respect. Frank Dodd and Tom Briggs were there too, watching the street. Aldridge was at the door talking to Harold Birch. He was at the door with his case of documents, speaking with Harold Birch, who had showed up at 5:30 that morning to make sure everything was filed right. Ethan made a note to thank him properly later. Hale showed up at 5 minutes before 6. He came with 2 of his men and a thin lawyer from Tucson named Pratt. Hale himself looked completely calm, like a man who had a new plan. That was the Victor Hale that put a chill down Ethan's spine, not the surprised one, but the one who adapts. The judge was a heavy man named Carey. He came out at exactly 6:15 and looked at the full room with some surprise. He read Aldridge's motion first, and he took his sweet time with it. Pratt jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is an attempt to bring in outside material." "Sit down, Mr. Pratt," the judge said. Judge Carey said it without even looking up from the paper. After he finished reading, he looked at Aldridge. "You are the examiner from Prescott?" "Franklin Aldridge, former federal land examiner." "Yes, Your Honor. And you are ready to testify that these documents are fraudulent?" "With proof, Your Honor, from 4 properties right here and another case in Maricopa County." Pratt was on his feet again. "Your Honor, this is not regular procedure." "Mr. Pratt," the judge said, his voice different now. "I have read the motion. I also spoke with the Federal Land Office in Prescott this morning. They confirmed Mr. Aldridge's position and his past work on this very notary seal." A heavy silence fell over the room. "This court will hear the evidence of fraud first. You will have a chance to cross-examine. Now, sit down." Pratt sat. Ethan felt Lydia let out a quiet breath beside him. He glanced at Hale and saw it. The first tiny crack in the man's confidence, behind his eyes. That steady confidence had run into something it had not planned on. It had run into Franklin Aldridge. Aldridge spoke for 40 minutes. He was clear, he was thorough, and he was completely factual. He laid out the registration number. He showed the record of the original notary's death and the report on the stolen seal. He showed the documents from Maricopa County. He walked the judge through each one of the Dry Creek claims. Seal number 1147. It was used 4 times on 4 different properties. Each one depended on that phony certification to be legal. Pratt tried to question him but got absolutely nowhere. You cannot argue with a stolen seal number in a record book. When Aldridge finished, Judge Carey looked directly at Hale for the first time. "Mr. Hale," he said, "do you have anything to say to the court?" Hale stood up, and Ethan watched a man who had built his whole world on lies start to see it crumble. For years, Mr. Hale built his empire on the fear of quiet folks, but standing there in that small Arizona courtroom, he was finally seeing that foundation crumble. "Your Honor," Hale said, trying to sound respectable, "I acted in good faith with the papers my lawyer provided. If the notary seal was a fake, then I am just as much a victim as anyone else." The judge's voice was cold as a stone. "That same stamp number showed up in Maricopa County 2 years ago. Your name was on those papers too as the one buying the land. I'm not buying any good faith argument this morning." He glanced at the marshal, a man who looked like he'd been praying this day would not get complicated. Marshal Webb, you best have a word with the territorial prosecutor before Mr. Hale decides to leave Dry Creek. The courtroom got so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Marshal Webb stood a little taller and nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Hale just stood there for a few long seconds. Then he slowly sat down, and the calm look on his face had turned into something hard and mean. He was a man running out of options. Pratt, his lawyer, was already leaning in, whispering urgently, but Hale did not seem to hear him. Judge Carey then looked out at all the ranchers filling the room. The property claims against Holloway, Reyes, Calhoun, and Dodd are all dismissed because of fraudulent papers, he announced. This court will send its findings to the prosecutor and the Federal Land Office. He paused for a moment. Is there any other business before this court? That is when Lydia stood up. Every head in the room turned to her. Even the judge gave her his full attention, like a man who knows how to spot the center of a storm. Your Honor, she said, her voice ringing clear and strong. My name is Lydia Hart. My father, Daniel Hart, lost his land in Flagstaff, Arizona, because of a claim that used this very same fake notary seal. That document is on file at the Yavapai County Court. I am asking that your findings today be sent to the Flagstaff office as evidence to challenge that old ruling. The room was dead silent. Pratt started to get up, but Hale put a hand on his arm, stopping him. Judge Carey looked at Lydia for a long time. Your request is noted and will be entered into the record, he said finally. We will make sure it is sent. He paused. I am sorry for what your family lost, Miss Hart. Getting it back will take time, but the record will now show the truth. Lydia sat back down. Ethan did not dare look at her. If he did, everyone in that room would see plain as day what he was feeling. And he was not ready for that. He just stared down at his own hands. The room emptied out slowly the way a place does after something heavy has been lifted. Folks gathered in small groups, talking low, shaking hands, and letting out long-held breaths. Jed Holloway found Ethan near the door and just shook his hand, saying more with that grip than words ever could. Your father's name is cleared, Ethan told him. Jed swallowed hard. Yes, he said, it is. Minnie Calhoun walked by and gave Ethan's arm a firm squeeze, which for her was like a standing ovation. Frank Dodd stopped, looking a little sheepish. I'll ride by your place next week, he said to Ethan. I have some good timber you can use for that south pasture fence. I'll take it, Ethan said. Tom Briggs was the last one. He stopped and looked over at Lydia, who was talking with her lawyer, Aldridge. Then he looked back at Ethan. She just came out of nowhere, Tom said, shaking his head. She sure did, Ethan agreed. It is a good thing for all of us that she did. Yes, Ethan said. It is. By midday, Hale was gone from Dry Creek. He left with his lawyer and his men, with Marshal Webb making sure they stayed on the right road. The lawman did not look so uncomfortable anymore. Hale rode out like a man who was not finished for good, but who had been stopped cold, right here, by people who refused to stay beaten. Ethan watched him go from the livery stable. He did not feel like cheering. He felt something quieter, something that would last. It was the feeling of a long cattle drive finally done. The herd safe. Not glory, just completion. He turned and walked back to Lydia, who was waiting with their horses. She had been watching Hale leave too. It is not over for my father's case, she said. It was not a complaint, just a fact. The process could take months, maybe longer. I know, he said. He took Birch's reins from her hand, and they started walking the horses toward the road. Aldridge said he's going to Flagstaff himself to handle the paperwork. She looked at him surprised. When did he say that? This morning, while you were talking to the judge. He also said that with our win here on the record, your father's case in Flagstaff has a strong foundation. That was his word, strong. Lydia was quiet for a minute. Strong, she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. Strong, Ethan said again. She gave a single nod. Then she did a small, private thing, probably without even knowing he saw. She pressed her hand flat against her chest for just a second, as if to make sure her heart was still there. He looked away to give her the moment. They rode home slow. There was no rush now, no enemy at their backs. The hurried worry of the last week had burned away, leaving something peaceful in its place. "What will you do now?" Ethan asked her. She rode beside him for a bit before she answered. "I need to go to Flagstaff. I have to tell my father in person, and I want to be the one to file the challenge with Aldridge's papers." "When?" he asked. "Soon," she said. "Maybe in a week." He was quiet for a while. "You would come back," he said. It was not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. She glanced at him. "The garden will not be ready for another month," she said. "Someone needs to be here for that." He did not smile. What he felt was bigger than a smile, something he had not had a word for in 3 long years. "The garden," he said softly. "And the apple trees," she added, her voice a little softer now. "You said you have not walked up to North Creek since Clara planted them. I would like to see if they are still growing." She paused. "I want to see what they have become with no one watching over them." Ethan looked down the road ahead. He pictured those apple trees growing all alone for 3 years, their roots digging deep into the dry ground, surviving longer than anyone would expect. "Good land always provides," he said. "I will take you up there when you get back." "All right," she said. The week went by fast, filled with the simple work of living. Lydia wrote 3 letters, 2 to Aldridge and 1 to the family in Flagstaff who was caring for her father. She worked 2 afternoons in the garden, and by the end of the week, the winter squash was in the ground, and the soil was turned and ready. Model. The soil was rich and dark, finally turned over proper for the first time in years. On her last day, she fixed the latch on the back window, the very one she had slipped through on the night she arrived. She did it without a word, and Ethan found it that evening. He tested it, feeling the clean, solid click of something finally made right. She came to say her goodbyes in the morning. He was by the corral. She stood there with that same quiet strength she had on her first night, but it was different now. She had arrived carrying loss. What she carried now was purpose. "The squash needs water every 2 days," she told him. "Not every day, every 2. "I know how to water squash," he grumbled. "You have not watered a single thing in 3 years, she pointed out. He could not argue with that. "Every 2 days, he agreed. "Ethan," she said, looking him square in the eye, "when I got here, I had run out of road." A heavy pause hung in the air. "I want you to know that what you did, what you chose, it was no small thing. For my father, for Jed, for all of them." Her voice was steady, but just barely. "You did not have to choose any of it." "I know," he said. "I am saying thank you," she said, leaving no room for doubt. He looked at her for a long moment. "Come back," he said. "That is all I am asking." She held his gaze. "I will come back," she promised. He stood and watched until she was past the east fence and the dust had settled. 6 weeks later, she returned. He knew it was her long before he could see her clearly. He knew by the horse's pace and the way she sat in the saddle, that straight-backed posture of someone riding with intention. He walked to meet her as she tied up the horse. She looked different. Not lighter exactly. Something in her had finally settled. What happened was subtle, but a tension she had carried for months finally let go. Standing there in the yard, she felt open and clear for the first time in a long while. "How is he?" Ethan asked. "He is alive," she answered. "Better than I thought." She took a breath. "I told him everything. He cannot talk much yet, but I know he understood. He just held my hand and did not let go for nearly an hour." Her voice was steady, but it took some effort. "The appeal has been filed. Aldridge put in all the paperwork. The judge is a new one, not the man who ruled against us before. It will take time." "But it is moving in the right direction," Ethan said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She glanced around at the fence line, the barn with its bright new shingles, and the garden. Even from a distance, you could see the squash vines spreading out just as she knew they would. "You watered them every 2 days," she said. "I told you I would," he replied. A simple, honest look passed over her face. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. When he opened it, he saw a rough pencil sketch of an orchard. It was just 4 trees in a row, but they were drawn from a deep memory. Each tree had its own shape, and the distance between them was exact. "I asked my father to draw it," she said. "He cannot write anymore, but he can still draw. This is what the apple trees looked like when my mother first planted them." She paused. "I just thought if we are going to plant some by your North Creek, you ought to know what a good orchard looks like when it gets its start." Ethan studied the drawing for a long time, looking at the 4 trees drawn by a sick man from 30 years of memory. He saw the careful space between them that good planting needs. "We will go up to the creek tomorrow," he said. "See what Clara's trees are going to need." "Tomorrow," she said. "Yes." He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. She went to check on her horse, and he went back to his work. The whole ranch seemed to settle around them, moving with the easy rhythm of a place where the right people are doing the work. That evening, she cooked dinner without a word. He walked in from the barn, and the smell of warm bread and something savory on the stove hit him, filling the house that had been cold for too many years. Lydia was putting 2 plates on the table. It was just like that first night, but this time nothing felt strange or uncertain. It just felt right. He sat down across from her, the lamplight warm between them. The kitchen was full of a comfortable quiet. After a minute, she spoke without looking up. "The garden should be ready in about 3 weeks." "I know," he said. "We ought to think about the south pasture after that," she said, "for the spring planting." "I have been thinking on it," he said. She looked up at him. "I reckon it can hold 30 head," he continued, "if we get the right grass in and manage the water." She just looked at him for a moment. Her expression was direct and warm, holding the story of their hard work, the court testimony, and the drawing of an orchard now resting in his pocket. It was the most honest thing he had seen in years. 30 is a good number," she said. "It is a start," he answered. They returned to their meal as the garden grew, outside in the dark. The new apple trees by the North Creek held on in the dry soil, waiting for morning. The fences stood tall and straight. The lamp in the window of Ethan Cole's ranch burned just as it had the night he came home to find a stranger at his table. It was a warm, steady light you could see from far away. Only now, it burned for 2. And Ethan Cole, a man who had chosen to live in the dark for 3 long years, finally understood something. He learned that the bravest thing a broken man can do is let someone else show him where the warmth is gone, and then decide with his eyes wide open to let it stay.